For more than 30 years, the United States has enjoyed predominance over world affairs. Following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, America was finally without its long-time existential foe. What followed was a period of relative peace for a United States that was now unchallenged as the world's sole superpower. American policymakers, eager to capitalize on this so called end of history, began to focus less on pragmatic foreign policy and more on nation building efforts to spread freedom, capitalism, and democracy across the globe. As noble as these intentions may have been, they distracted an entire generation of American leaders from an enemy few of them even recognized. For many years, conventional wisdom shared by everyone from Wall Street bankers to Washington, D.C. foreign policy wonks said that China's embrace of capitalist principles would lead to a new partnership between Beijing and Washington. It took many years for American policymakers to realize that they had sorely misunderstood China's intent. It wasn't until 2018 when the United States national security community truly started taking the China threat seriously. My guest today is the man behind that monumental shift. Elbridge Colby was the lead architect of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the most significant defense strategy revision in a generation. He is also the author of The Strategy of Denial, in which he lays out how and why the US defense must fundamentally change to address China's aggressive ambitions. But with any fundamental change in policy comes detractors, and Colby certainly has many of those. Depending on who you ask, he's either a pioneer of defense strategy or an isolationist doomsayer. Regardless, there is no doubt that he is a bold visionary in the defense world. I invite you to listen to our conversation and judge for yourself. All right, joining me today is Elbridge Colby. Mr. Colby, how you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you, Russ.
Awesome. Well, hey, I just want to say first and foremost, I'm a big fan of yours. I came
Great to hear.
across your, I guess now famous Twitter feed, which has been an excellent source of information for me, and I think a lot of other folks working in the DC policy space. Um, I first of all just wanted to get into a little bit about you and your background. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you became one of the foremost, I think, thinkers on national security today?
Wow. Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. And famous to some, infamous to others, scorched to my opponents, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I've been in the national security field for pretty much my whole career. I went to law school, but don't take my legal advice. So, um, I increasingly focused on the China the problem and defense just because I guess my interests are drawn there, but also because of the gravity of the challenge and its increasing immediacy. So yeah, and I'm trying to as I like to use the metaphor of the Titanic and the iceberg, try to do what I can to I can nudge us, but maybe together we can steer away from this impending iceberg, and maybe the iceberg will melt. Maybe it's an optical illusion, but it looks like an iceberg, and I think we should treat it as such.
Yeah, I think if it looks like an iceberg, feels like an iceberg, and sounds like an iceberg, maybe we can trust our senses on
Yeah,
that. But
yeah.
actually, this
No,
brings me to perfect segue to my first question for you. Um, I saw on your Twitter you posted a really interesting graph showing global GDP across the world, kind of like a regional map, and you use that as an explainer to folks as to why the US needs to focus its efforts on China. Can you kind of get into a little bit of that and how you made that argument?
sure. Well, I think that that map, which was I think it was done by a guy on Twitter named Swiss Shepherd, who does some great stuff. Um, I think it's a visual representation of things often that I'm trying to say and communicate, but the visual has a more, in a way, it's more potent, or it's as potent. So it's important to use both. But just the size of the circles in terms of growth and, future scale of the global economy. And I think it's just a pure visual representation of something that, in a sense, is kind of one of the key parts of this debate and this problem, which is that, Europe and the Middle East are not the center of the world. And, where the GDP growth is, where the population is, that's really concentrated in Asia, and that we should act accordingly with our foreign policy. And that it's sort of bizarre. People don't necessarily directly confront that point, but they sort of resist it. Um, and I think that's why I keep hammering at it, because if you accept that point, it should change our foreign policy. Um, and yet we're kind of acting like we don't need to change, and I think that's a mistake, big mistake.
Yeah, shout out to Swiss Shepherd, by the way. He's a follower of
Yeah,
the podcast and my account
yeah,
as well. So
he's no, it's great stuff.
he does do great stuff. Highly recommend. Little free shout out to him there. If you're not following on Twitter, you guys should be. Yeah, I think it is a good point that you make right there. That it's bizarre to me. We're in the third administration that I've seen, in this space that is saying China is the problem. Right.
Right,
Three
right.
administrations now have made that a top priority. Yet, if you look at practice and how things are being implemented in terms of funding, in terms of focus, that does not seem to be the case. Where do you see the disconnect, and why do you think it exists?
I think it's because, I would say the Trump administration is a little different, and the more than a little different, in terms of, like, there was significant momentum behind focusing on China, although there was division clearly. I think in the Obama years, there were elements, to their credit, like Herb Campbell, who were pushing for an Asia pivot, but it was pretty thin. It didn't reflect a significant, the president wasn't there. The key advisors like Susan Rice, John Kerry weren't there. It started to emerge in the Pentagon because people were seeing the scale of the Chinese buildup, and they could see where it was going. And that's what, we working in the Pentagon at the beginning of the Trump administration were kind of taking that to another level of seriousness. I think I've thought a lot about this and why it's so difficult for the system to adapt. And I think it's a combination of things, which are sort of, if I go back to kind of basic human behavior, I think there's a degree of hubris. So, which you see from both senior Republicans and, like in the Senate and the President Biden, which is, we're America, like, we can do it. And it's like, well, have you looked at the facts and the figures? And a lot of that has to do with age, I think. I'm in my 40s, you're younger than I am, but, like, a lot of these, the tell is the way these guys talk about Reagan. Like, I'm a fan of President Reagan. I like President Reagan. But I'm in my 40s, and I remember Reagan as a child. But for these guys, talking about Reagan is like a trump card to them. It's like, I cornered them with my argument by comparing it to Reagan. And there are people younger than I am, like, you weren't even alive when Ronald Reagan was president. And it's like, it's becoming ancient history. And they're like thinking, I'm going to rerun. I hear from a lot of the guys around town, we're going to rerun Reagan's 1980 playbook. And I'm like, have you looked at the demographic profile, the fiscal profile, the political profile, the military profile? Our adversary is far wealthier and more industrial capable than we are, et cetera. So there's hubris. And then I think there's a tendency to, frankly, underestimate the Chinese. And you see it, for instance, with this, like, rush to say the Chinese economy is collapsing, which is possible. Color me skeptical that it's going to collapse. I think it's more likely to slow and keep growing. And there again, they're connected, but there's like a hubris. But it's also, I think, the rapidity and scale of China's advances has been so fast that it's like disorienting for a lot of these people, especially, just in the space of 40 years. I first went to Beijing in the mid 1990s, and people were a lot of bicycles on the road. 20 years later, the people, there's Maserati dealerships, and they're putting them in, trying to put people on the moon or whatever, or something like that. So and I think and that's why that kind of graph is so important. It's like, I was at the Shangri-La Forum last year, and it was very striking, and it was interesting on the Ukraine front, but just the defense minister, who's now the president of Indonesia, gave a speech, and the defense minister of the Netherlands was there, and she was very vocal. And I was like, well, one of these countries has like over 200 million people and is going to be one of the top economies in the world, and is going to be really important in 2030. Another of these countries was really important in 1650 and ran the Dutch East Indies for several hundred years. I'm not saying the Netherlands is not important. It's a nice country, very important in certain contexts, but it's 10 million people. It's 1/20th the size of Indonesia and declining probably. So like you got to kind of put that in people's faces for them to like ultimately, and unfortunately it may take a generational shift, but we don't have time for that.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. I don't even think a lot of our policymakers know how big Indonesia is. And I can't believe I'm saying that, but just having spent 10 years in
It's huge.
DC, like,
Yeah. Indonesia barely comes up the radar. It's going to be one of the top 10 countries in the world
yeah,
in economics.
it's crazy. But you're right. There is this inordinate focus put on not our European partners. Don't get me wrong. I'm half European. Love them. Love
True.
Europe.
Oh,
Europe's wonderful.
right.
But
Yeah.
and no
Not
one's arguing
personal.
that. I think it's so
It's
funny.
not personal. It's business.
It's business.
Like,
It's it's priorities, business, and limited resources. And I love how
yeah.
these folks put you up with the criticisms you get are truly remarkable, right? It's well, Bridge Colby wants us to focus on Asia, so clearly he hates Europe. You know what I mean? It's these dichotomies and these
And it's
false
like,
dichotomies are ridiculous.
it's also like, if you're like aware of my like intellectual background, I have like a real commitment to the Western inheritance and all that. But it's like, excuse me, I thought the foreign policy was not to be about who we like and not like it's about what's in the interests of Americans, right? So small R Republican foreign policy. So who I feel comfortable with is not the point. Anyway, like I don't know, maybe I feel more comfortable with Asians sometimes. Like what isn't that the kind of world we're supposed to live in? That's what I thought. I don't know. Like anyway, that's all does immaterial. The point is, it's like it's not about we have all these things in Europe. It's like let's look at this in a business-like fashion.
Right. Yeah. And I wish folks realize that this isn't about a disdain or anything. This is pragmatism. And that's an unfortunate fact that I think so many folks are ignoring about the conversation.
Well, I think that's like I actually take comfort from this sort of the attacks being not comfort, but like personalized or they're obviously distorted because it's like, oh, so I guess you're not confident in like your like a real argument. It's like, bring me a real argument. Like, and there are real arguments about do we need to defend Taiwan? Is China pursuing hegemony or is there a security? There are lots of things, but like the fact that we should be focused much more on Asia, that just seems kind of inarguable.
I would agree, and I think that graph that you posted, which I'll try to include in the final product here, so folks know what we're talking about. I think that really speaks volumes and gives the numbers. It's the feels versus reals foreign policy. That you hear jokes about. It's like, yeah, man. It feels nice to say we're America, damn it, and we can do it all. But reality is, do we have the industrial base? Are we doing enough military spending? There's a lot of things that go along with that.
Well put. And the thing is, and this is why I go against the elite a lot and the establishments because it feels good if you're Joe Biden. But what happens if there's a war and his feeling good and not dealing with the problem? It's going to feel pretty terrible for guys who go Winchester because they don't have enough missiles to get killed. I was up debating Timothy Snyder, very effective debater, very committed to the cause of Ukraine, and and in that sense, I have respect for his conviction and his ability. I thought it was a good debate, at least from what I could tell from how people responded. But he was making a very moral claim, and I was like, look, I'm not going to concede that your argument is more moral. To the contrary, because look, a war could happen, and I want to make sure our people are as ready as possible. And it could be the standing forces, but if it turns into a long war that Americans are directly involved in, there could be attacks on the homeland. There could be a call up of the reserves and the guard and maybe a draft. Let's not have the nice feelings now. We're America. Let's get real now so we can feel less bad later.
Totally.
That's the attitude we should have from our leadership.
Yeah, it is. And so you, I think, one thing, granted, you ruffle a lot of feathers in a good way, as you should be. But I think one thing that you get a lot of flack for, and I think this is a pretty hot take, maybe we could say that you've had, is that you've expressed that there is a real possibility that the United States could lose to China in this situation. And if you could explain exactly why you feel that way, and then also what do the consequences look like if we don't prepare now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so nobody really knows how a war would go because it's such a, so there's like nobody really knows. But, you know, in the year 2000, if they gamed out the Taiwan scenario, it was clear the Americans were going to win at a relatively low cost if we put our backs into it because, numbers, position, Chinese capabilities that we'd be able to observe. What's would beyond question at this point, I think, is that if both sides committed heavily, it would be a very bloody affair. Uh, it's possible that the Chinese are 3 feet tall as opposed to 6 or 10 feet tall. I don't think that's a prudent planning assumption. If you assume they're like 5 or 6 feet tall, um, you look at numbers, you look at position, you look at the relative political resolve, you look at where the fight would actually take place. You look at the industrial capacity. You look at what we can know even from the outside about the performance of their military systems. Sure, they have problems, but the British failed 2 Trident tests in a row, so nobody's perfect. We've had uh, space, rockets explode on the tarmac repeatedly. So like nobody's perfect. I mean, they may be less perfect than we are. Maybe I don't know. They conducted hypersonic tests successfully that we didn't even know were possible according to the FT. So if you look at all that and you kind of do even just a baseline model, in your head, that's going to be tough. And then you look at the gaming. Now, the results of gaming is used politically now. It's tendentious. So there's no results of one game or another are indicative. But I think it's revealing that people like David Akmanik of the Rand Corporation have said repeatedly over the years that we've lost repeatedly. And CSIS reported in their assessment of their own war games, where they did a lot of them, even though their results were somewhat positive in terms of attrition, kind of a stalemate or U.S. success. Classified wargaming, according to them, I'm not saying this myself, but they said that classified wargaming was more pessimistic. So if you just look at the record, now, again, other war games may go up and down and blah, blah, blah. But then you look at okay, that's just like intuitive. And then you look at the reports of how things are going. It just was reported in early April that every single major Navy program is delayed. The ICBM is delayed. Meanwhile, the Chinese continue to beat out their own target dates. Aquilino, the commander of Indo-Pacific Command, who's actually been not great in public, in my view, he said the other day that the Chinese are on track to meet their 2027 goal. So, I have no idea. Anybody who speaks with confidence about how a war would go in this circumstance shouldn't be taken that seriously. But there is a very real risk that we could lose, and so we are and I think we have to assume that it would be very bloody at best. So in that situation, I'm of the view peace through strength. Don't give your adversary even like the plausible idea that he could be successful at a reasonable cost, and that's essentially what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that that's an important factor here. One other thing that I think is a good segue into something that I recently saw this week. We're now at a point where we're paying exceedingly high interest rate payments on our national debt to the
Right.
tune of $1 trillion. So
Exactly.
we just had the budget was just released from the White House, which comes in at about the defense budget comes in at about 850, give or take, depending on how you
Right.
carve up the pie. So we're now at a point where we are spending more to service the debt of the country than we are on our military. Now, I'm a bit of a fiscal conservative, and I can tell you, both in my life and in policy world, but I think that's a pretty terrifying prospect when we're facing down what's being considered, the new Cold War with China.
Yeah.
How do you
Well,
see this factor playing into the problem? Because right now, I
you
mean,
see,
if
here's
you
the
look at the
factor.
defense
This is
budget,
another.
it's bad.
Yeah, this is like I was dealing with this guy who's like, he wants to rerun the Reagan playbook. He's been in the Republican administrations. He's just like, we just need the willpower. We need Ronald Reagan back. We need to bring him back to life cryogenically and then just run that playbook. And I was like, hey, man, or have you listened to what Jay Powell was saying? And forget about what Jay Powell was saying. What you're saying, we're paying 100%, or right, debt to GDP is almost 100%. Interest rates are huge. And the demographic profile of the country is different. It's not as young as it was in that state. Growth has slowed substantially. We're doing better than the Europeans, I guess, but like we're not growing as fast as we did in the 1970s. 1970s weren't great, but in the post-war era. And so there's all these, and then this is the kind of like, this is part of the difficulty of being in these debates is like, there's this la la land kind of argument that we're going to double our defense budget. You get people out. I just think like, honestly, if you're making that argument, it's kind of like, it should be like foul, red card or whatever, like, penalty box, because like that's la la land. And neither President Trump nor President Biden, as far as I can tell, is campaigning on dramatic increases in defense spending, let alone cutting Social Security and Medicare or heavily raising taxes or et cetera, any of the predicates. And we can't borrow at the level to keep like that's clear. And any Republican, and by the way, the Republicans in the Congress, especially in the House, are saying they don't want more spending, and they're right. I mean, what exactly to do about that is not, I don't have the answer, or pretend to have the answer, but I think Mike Johnson has said this is like a serious national emergency. Okay, so if you're like, we can't afford not to be a global superpower, I don't even know what that means. It's not, by the way, it's not written in the Constitution that we need to be a superpower. It's supposed to be a republic for the common welfare of the citizen. Right? Okay, I think we need to have a pretty strong foreign policy to secure that. But like, just saying that does not solve the fundamental mismatch between like a multi-theater foreign policy in a world where we are 20% of global GDP and located in North America, and a situation where we're heavily indebted and like deficits are higher than ever in a non-emergency period, you know? So like that's the reality. So I think the defense budget, and by the way, the military services are planning on relatively flat defense budgets. So maybe there would be some increases, we could hope, but not order of magnitude dramatic. And the other thing that I don't believe that we can bet on technological offsets in a cheap way that would have an enduring advantage. Like we should invest in technology. We should invest in novel operational concepts. Absolutely. But I think what we're seeing in Ukraine, actually, there was an interesting article that came out, I think it was in the Politico, about how the Ukrainians are saying, look, stuff gets like adapted to, and the Ukrainians are saying this notion that the Russians are a bunch of trolls or orcs or whatever is ridiculous. Like they adapt, unfortunately. We wish they were just mindless orcs. They're not. They're adapting. So we have to assume that's going to also be the case with China, which is the world's largest like drone producer, for instance. We have technological advantages in some areas, but not necessarily across the board. And in many areas, they're shrinking.
Yeah, that's something that has become a bit of a concern. I've referred to it as the Porscheification of the military, right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
somebody posted, I forget who it was. I reposted it on Twitter. I forget what it was, but they basically said like, look, they made brilliant handmade tanks in World War II
Right.
Germany. They were exquisite, but they made one for every 10 Shermans we put off the line.
Down all the time. Right.
Yeah. So it's like that. That is not to say that the old Stalin line, quantity as a quality of itself. And
Right.
granted, we do need to be exquisite and we need to be top of the edge, of course, maintain that military edge. But there is something to be said after I think watching Ukraine that there is a benefit to simply having stuff, which
Totally
brings me into my next one. Just getting in a little bit of current events here. You've been vocal on the prioritization of the Ukraine war from the United States' perspective, and I think you and I are in agreement that ultimately Europe really needs to be footing more of this bill. What is your assessment as things lie right now, and where do you see them going?
I think it's improved in the last few months. I think for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the growing resistance in this country to, underwriting kind of a very, very large checks going forward. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the supplemental as of now in early April, but I think in any case, it's clear that the support for heavy, you know, financial support for Ukraine is declining. Um, and there's an asymmetry of interest where the Europeans care more about that for good reason than we do. Not to say that we don't care, but we do. But they should care more, so they should do more. So, you know, uh, obviously, President Trump has made this, and I think rightly so, a central part of his message that they need to do more for themselves. And I honestly, at the end of the day, I think a lot of it's kind of common sense. I mean, I was on with Chatham House, the British think tank. I made this in other context, but like, it's like, really, like, why are we spending 3 to 3.5%? And like, a lot of Americans think the economy's bad. There's a lot of economic insecurity. What? Sorry, why is it that Americans have to spend more on European defense than Germans? There's no good argument for that. Zero good argument. And so, like, it just makes sense, and it's not sustainable. And the Europeans for a long time, they resisted it because they had to pay less. Right? It's a great deal, right? Other than like the Brits and the French, who like to keep their power projection military, the past and all that. But I think they thought they'd placated us in the Trump administration enough. Then when Biden came in, they was like, the pressure's off. Now that President Trump is back and the nominee, and they see that it's not only he's back, but also that it's an enduring thing that's reflected in like the opposition to supplemental emerged over a long period of time. And again, without getting into the specifics of the supplemental, but just like the skepticism about further support is an organic growth in the American that reflects like the opposition to the forever wars, concerns about spending, the border, security at home, et cetera, that are like kind of deeply rooted pragmatic concerns. How much they should be listened to is a different issue, or how to address them. But I think they have to be recognized in that way. And so I think the Europeans are now finally like it's sinking in, like, this is for real. But I don't know how enduring it's going to be. I mean, I think Germany is the key. I mean, the British government, for instance, is terrible. The British government comes over here and lectures us all the time, and the British are like basically cutting defense spending, and their military is in pretty bad shape. And Macron is like talking about sending troops to Ukraine, and like the French military can't really sustain that at any scale. The Germans, who are the most important on this, the Poles are fantastic, so they deserve to be supported and elevated and lauded. The Germans, Pistorius, the defense minister, is great, as far as I can tell, and he's saying the Germans may need to spend 3.5%, but I don't know if that's going to reflect the decisions of the government or even the Social Democrats. So, we'll see. But like, my point to the Europeans is Americans can't fight multiple wars at one time. It's just we don't have the military for it. The political support isn't there for like massive wars all over the place, let alone, and not there for major increases in defense spending. So if you call our bluff, I think we will continue doing what we're going to do. And you're the ones who are going to be exposed. So you should really take care of yourself more. Doesn't mean we abandon NATO. I don't think we should leave NATO or abandon NATO, but it's got to be more equitable and more of a partnership model. It's pretty, I mean, honestly, it's pretty common sense. That's the weird thing about a lot of this opposition. It's like,
it really is. Like,
it's like, duh. Like, really?
Yeah. Come on. Like, yeah. If I had one of the world's largest armies, a country away from me, I think I'd probably take that fairly seriously, right? I mean,
like, I'm not saying they need to like turn into like 10% of GDP. Like, they just need to have some fraction of what they had in 1988, when like most of the Germans who are alive, or many of them, had conscription. Like, it's part of the deal. Okay, it sucks, obviously, whatever. But like, I don't know. What do you want? I didn't create the Russian military. I didn't create. That's just what it is,
Right. Yeah, it's actually. I think that you bring up the NATO issue at a timely time. It's the 75th birthday of the alliance today, as we're recording. Now, granted, anyone who's watched this podcast, I'm assuming, is pretty familiar with where NATO's history came from, so we won't give a background on that. But, it was a Cold War alliance. It has since been, I would say, almost kind of lost without a cause in a certain sense. Overall, a great alliance. I mean, I think overall it's done incredible things for the United States foreign policy and the world in general. Also, it's kept a continent out of going to war with each other, so that's great too. But we are post Cold War. We're no longer facing down a Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union. Where do you see the alliance now, and how do you see its role going forward in the future?
My basic view, look, NATO's great, like especially Cold War NATO. It was a hardcore military alliance. It was designed to defend Europe. It had a core mission. It did a good enough job. It was a lot of tough negotiations. It was a very business-like thing. We gave the Europeans a real hard time. They gave us a hard time, but it succeeded in its goal. And it was like a real military operation. You know, if you look in the 1980s, the return of forces for Germany exercises. I mean, there were, U.S. and German forces and allied forces all along the German border, and they were ready to fight. Great. Post Cold War NATO, as part of post Cold War policy, it turned into, kind of more of a political entity where, it was out of business. It expanded. It had a kind of political stuff. It was like fine, but not, it was more like a reflection of the strategic environment. 2014 and after, especially 2022, it's has a choice. Like, does it stay as this nice political talking shop that's the modern equivalent of the Holy Roman Empire, or is it like a real military alliance? And I think that hopefully it keeps moving in the direction of real military alliance. But if it's going to be a real military alliance, it needs to take account of the military realities and the fiscal realities, for instance, of the Americans and others, which is to say, in 2005, Donald Rumsfeld said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of everything." Different. I don't think that was well advised at the time, but also different world. Now we're in a much different world with China, obviously Russia, but also Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Europe's got to do more. And it's got to go, just got to, like, honestly, I think if it's going to be successful, it's going to go back to the basics. And so on the 75th anniversary and all this year, we're going to get all this preachiness on NATO that's designed to, like, basically subtext being Republican voters bad, isolationist, they're blah, blah. And it's like, actually, a lot of Republican voters today are expressing exactly what Dwight Eisenhower was saying. Dwight Eisenhower wanted to pull all the U.S. troops out of Europe. Mark Mansfield, who was the Mansfield, who was the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat from Montana, Mansfield Amendment threatened to pull U.S. forces out of Europe. I don't think that was a good idea at the time. I wasn't around, but LBJ charged the Germans for the privilege of having U.S. forces stationed on their territory. Because it was like, this is not something we're going to do by ourselves, financially, militarily, politically, etc. So that all said, if we get back into that business-like, pragmatic point of view, you have to adapt to survive. The business model of the 1990s and the 2000s and the early 2010s ain't working anymore. So let's adapt the business model. If the business is going to survive, it's got to adapt. That means the Europeans, especially the Germans, but the Europeans, Northern Eastern Europeans especially, and the other Europeans who want to be taken seriously on the bigger stage, like Britain and France, they got to do more. And that's it. So, like, personally, I actually think, like, all this celebration stuff is kind of like, it might even be counterproductive because, like, we don't need more NATO as symbolism. We need NATO as, like, business. And so I, like, get to work,
The Holy Roman Emperor bit, I think, is pretty apt comparison for anybody who knows their history.
Yeah.
So I think one thing, look, hey, we got to pitch the book, right? Because we got to pitch the book. It's a podcast,
right? There you go.
Right over here. So you wrote a book, The Strategy of Denial. I read it. I loved it. I think it elaborates all your points to a great extent, and it's a relatively quick read. I was pretty impressed with how much detail you were able to get in there. The quick read.
I took it. It's hard to make it, but I really worked to make it, like, accessible. It's not easy read, but it's like accessible read. You don't need a previous expertise or, I don't use a lot of, like, acronyms or,
But also impeccably well cited, I would add. Like, if people want to get into that side of things, I know some of the nerdier wonks.
I actually had to cut a lot of the endnotes too because Yale was like, forget it, and it's too long.
Yeah, I bet the publisher was probably, I'm sure. But so I want to give you the opportunity here, segue from the book. If you were a DoD official at one point, you helped write the NDS back in the day. If you could be king for a day
Yeah.
three things that you would change about American foreign policy and national security strategy, what would they be?
Well, I mean, I would focus on China and Asia. I would prioritize the military shield until we get it right. And I would probably, and by doing so, I would probably tone down some like the ideological and like moralistic kind of stuff, especially until we got the shield right. And I would move to a different model of, alliances. I mean, they're all connected, right? Which is, more of a partnership model, which is you got to do more, but in exchange, we're not going to be as bossy on every little issue as we traditionally have. And I think, allies like Israel and Poland and, India, Vietnam, allies broadly construed, some of them might Finland, I don't know, some of the Europeans, and people get used to it. And it'll be a different approach. Doesn't mean we're an isolationist or whatever, it's just canard, but like it'll be a different model. But the most important thing to get right is the military denial along the first island chain, especially Taiwan. If we get that right and we deter a war, everything else will work out. But the key issue is whether there's going to be a war with China in the coming years. And if it happens, whether we win it or lose it. Because everything else is going to be like, if there's no war, all this economic stuff will sort itself out. Countries will de-risk to some extent. They'll adapt their regulation and there'll be a kind of new equilibrium. It's not, TikTok, blah, 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 whatever. It'll kind of equilibrate. If there's a war, A, that's terrible on its own. B, if we lose it, we don't have the standing to fix those other problems. So the key thing is to make sure there's a balance of power. And the way to make sure of that is a military balance in the key theater. And that's why NATO, that's the best part of NATO, not like the 1990s, symbolism stuff. Expansion's fine in most part, but like the key thing about NATO is our understanding that we could not give the Soviets a rational ability to use a military force aggressively in Europe. And we succeeded well enough in that. And that's why I don't like the Cold War analogy in general terms because I think it's reductive and in some ways off base. Where I do like it is in the military domain, where I think it has a lot of relevance. Although the nuclear weapons, I think, are less salient, although they are more salient than they have been since the end of the Cold War. But that's where I think that the analogy works and doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. Great talk here, Bridge. I appreciate it. I know
Great.
we're coming up on time here. One thing that if I could
Sure.
just sneak one last question in here, and it's a little different than probably questions you
Okay.
normally get, but one big thing that I try to emphasize with this podcast, with people I talk to, my writing, I try to make it accessible, and I try to encourage people who are interested in these issues to get involved with them.
Good. Yeah.
Because you and I both at one time were young guys coming to DC, coming wherever we were going, wanting to make a difference. What is your advice to somebody who's interested in these issues, a young person who maybe is curious about getting into national security policy, maybe joining the military, doing something where they can influence on this? What's your advice to them in order to be successful?
Well, that's a big, that's a big question. I think you got to go with where your skills and interests are. People are different. So, what I would say is I came in thinking I got to have a whole life plan and what I found is I've become much more inductive and you kind of feel your way across the water by the stones. Look, I think the big challenge is going to be great power politics. China, Asia is going to be the center of the world. So putting your effort there, we are still going to need people to work on, of course, on Europe, Middle East, Latin America. I think more with the mindset of where they fit in the pecking order in terms of resources and so forth. But I think that's the area where I would, and I would say, like, I guess my advice that maybe that I could add is, I think the current establishment seems very strong and like they seem like they have all the commanding heights, but it's a very brittle control because it's heavily dependent on older people who have got their luck, on like key positions, and it doesn't reflect strategic or political reality. So it's going to change. Whether change is, President Trump is a perfect representation, but also newer members of Congress who are getting elected have a different view. It's going to change. So if you're a young person, don't go in like that kind of the old neocon religion, to be candid. Like, just don't even waste your time. Like I have to deal with that. Like I have to deal, like, unfortunately, that's like my cross to bear in this area. But like you
We
look
appreciate
at the
it.
new world. Yeah, exactly. Like, no, thank you. I just like, but anyway, like just go out and make a foreign policy that's more practical and better for Americans.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Well, Bridge Colby, I appreciate it. The book is Strategy of Denial. Where can folks get it?
You can get it on Amazon or Yale University Press or wherever you shop. So,
Awesome.
and it's available in a couple new languages too. So,
Oh,
if you're
nice. Very
more.
cool. All right. Well, hey,
Good. Well, thanks, Russ.
yeah, no,
Great talking.
a lot of fun. Thanks very much.